I never meant to find it. That's what makes the whole thing so ridiculous in hindsight. How one ordinary Tuesday can shatter everything you thought was real. There I was, searching for a hammer to hang a new photo of us from our anniversary trip to Maine, when I found the receipt tucked inside his toolbox. A hotel receipt. The Harborview Inn in Portland, just 3 miles from his office. 3 nights, not 1. And dated last month, when he was supposedly at a conference in Chicago. My hands trembled as I sat on the garage floor, concrete cold against my legs. 26 years of marriage, and suddenly I was a detective in my own home. I pulled out my phone and searched for the hotel, boutique, romantic, overlooking the water. Perfect for couples, the website announced cheerfully. Funny how words can feel like slaps. I put everything back exactly as I found it and went inside, the hammer forgotten. Our house felt different now. Every framed photo a possible lie, every surface hiding potential secrets. I made dinner like always, his favorite lasagna, garlic bread on the side. I poured wine and lit candles, playing the part I'd perfected over decades. "This is a nice surprise," Richard said when he walked in, kissing my cheek. His cologne was the same one I'd given him for Christmas. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion," I replied, my voice steady. Just felt like doing something nice. We ate while he talked about work. The Wilson account, office politics, his annoying new intern. I nodded and smiled in all the right places, watching him across the flickering candles. This man who slept beside me for nearly 3 decades. This stranger. "Portland seems nice this time of year," I said finally, setting down my fork. His chewing slowed. Just slightly. Most would miss it, but I knew every micro-expression on that face. "I suppose." "Why?" "Just thinking we should visit sometime. It's not far." He reached for his wine. "Sure, maybe in the spring." That's when I knew for certain. Richard was a lot of things, but he had never been a good liar. His tells were subtle but unmistakable. The way his left eyebrow twitched slightly, how he suddenly became very interested in his food. I had spent years interpreting these small betrayals of truth, from white lies about liking my mother's Christmas sweaters to half-truths about working late, but never for something like this. I excused myself to the bathroom and locked the door, stared at my reflection, the lines around my eyes that hadn't been there when we met, the gray strands I'd stopped coloring last year when Richard said he loved my natural look. Had that been a lie too? I splashed cold water on my face and made a decision. I would say nothing. Not yet. Back at the table, I poured more wine and asked about his upcoming business trip to Denver next week. He launched into details about meetings and client dinners, his confidence returning. I wondered who she was, the woman who would be meeting him there. Or would it be someone new? I pictured her younger, of course. Less complicated, unburdened by the weight of our shared history. That night, Richard fell asleep quickly as he always did, one arm flung across my side of the bed. I lay awake, mapping the geography of our bedroom ceiling. When had it started? How long had I been playing the fool? Did our friends know? Our children? The questions multiplied in the dark, each one more painful than the last. By morning, I had made another decision. I would investigate, but not confront. Not until I knew everything. Because despite the agony twisting inside me, I recognized something else rising from the ashes of what I thought was my life. Curiosity. Not just about his betrayal, but about myself. About who I might become without the comfort of blind trust. About what else I might discover once I started really looking. As I made coffee and packed his lunch like I had every morning for decades, I realized with startling clarity that in his attempt to lead a double life, Richard had inadvertently given me permission to discover my own. For someone who had never spied on another human being, I took to it with unsettling ease. The day after finding the receipt, I created a new email address and ordered a small GPS tracker, paying extra for overnight shipping. I told myself this wasn't who I was, that decent people don't track their spouses or scroll through their text messages while they shower. But then again, decent people don't book romantic getaways while their wives think they're in Chicago. The package arrived discreetly, and I slipped the tracker into the lining of Richard's favorite briefcase, the expensive leather one I'd saved for months to buy him for our 20th anniversary. Our daughter had called me old-fashioned when I mentioned the gift. Dad can just use his phone to find things, Mom. Nobody uses those tracker things anymore. The irony wasn't lost on me now. For 2 weeks, I watched his movements on my phone while pretending everything was normal. Office, client meetings, gym, home. Nothing suspicious. No hotels, no unexplained stops. I began to wonder if I'd overreacted, if there was an innocent explanation for the receipt. Maybe it had been for a client. Maybe he'd booked it for a colleague. The stories I created grew increasingly elaborate, my mind desperate to construct a reality where my marriage wasn't a facade. Then came Thursday. Richard packed for his Denver trip, kissing me goodbye with promises to call when he landed. I helped him load his suitcase into the car, wave from the porch, and return to my command center at the kitchen table. His flight would arrive at 3:47 p.m. Mountain Time. His first meeting wasn't until tomorrow morning. I watched the blue dot of his tracker move to the airport, disappear during the flight, then reappear in Denver, as expected. He took a cab from the airport, but instead of heading downtown to his usual hotel near the convention center, the dot moved south, eventually stopping in a residential neighborhood. My heart pounded as I zoomed in on the map. A house, not a hotel, not his client's office. A house in a quiet suburban neighborhood with a 2-car garage and what looked like a swimming pool in the backyard. I saved the address and switched to social media, something I rarely used but now approached with the intensity of an intelligence operative. It took less than 20 minutes to find her. Jennifer Lamont, 38, marketing director at Pinnacle Systems, one of Richard's biggest clients. Her profile showed a smiling blonde with the kind of confidence I'd once had, standing beside the pool I'd seen on the map. Divorced 2 years ago, according to her relationship status. Mother to a teenage son, who appeared to be away at boarding school based on her posts lamenting an empty nest. I scrolled through her photos with detached fascination. Charity galas, mountain hikes, beach vacations, and there, nearly a year back, a conference in Atlanta where Richard had also been. They were standing in a group photo, not beside each other, but both present. That must have been where it started. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Landed safely. Hotel is nice. Meeting Tom for drinks before dinner. Miss you. I stared at the message, at the casual lie delivered with such ease. The blue dot on my tracking app hadn't moved from Jennifer's house. I typed back, glad you arrived safely. Have fun with Tom. Love you. The words felt foreign, as if I were playing a character in a poorly written play. I set my phone down and walked to our bedroom, opening Richard's side of the closet. I ran my hands over his neatly hung shirts, the sweaters I'd given him over the years, the ties arranged by color. Then, I noticed something I'd somehow missed. A small section at the far end that looked less worn, less familiar. Newer clothes I didn't recognize. Clothes he didn't wear around me. In his dresser, I found similar evidence. Socks I hadn't purchased. Underwear more stylish than his usual preference. A cologne hidden behind his aftershave that smelled nothing like the scent I'd grown accustomed to. He'd been preparing for his other life right under my nose, and I'd been too trusting to notice. That night, I slept in our bed surrounded by these discoveries, these artifacts of betrayal. I dreamt of nothing. When I woke, the tracker showed Richard at his downtown hotel, right where he should be for his morning meetings. The performance continued for both of us. Over the next 3 days, I watched Richard's dot bounce between his legitimate business appointments and Jennifer's house. I read his texts about exhausting meetings and boring client dinners. I responded with news from home, recipes I was trying, updates on our son's new job. We were 2 actors in different plays, reading lines that no longer connected. On Sunday evening, I picked him up from the airport. He looked tired but happy, kissing me with what seemed like genuine affection. How was Denver? I asked as we drove home. Productive, he said, squeezing my hand. But I'm glad to be home. I squeezed back, wondering if he could feel the difference in my touch, the knowledge in my fingers. I'm glad too, I said. And for the first time in our marriage, I drove with one hand on the wheel and the other holding a complete lie. People expect confrontations to be dramatic. Plates thrown, voices raised, mascara running down tear-stained cheeks. That's what television taught us betrayal should look like. But as I planned how to address Richard's infidelity, I discovered a strange calm settling over me, like snowfall silencing a forest. For 2 weeks after the Denver trip, I said nothing. Instead, I prepared. I met with a lawyer who specialized in divorce, a brisk woman with silver hair and a handshake that meant business. I gathered financial documents, made copies of tax returns, photographed valuables. I opened a separate bank account and transferred my inheritance from my father, money that had always been mine, but that I'd foolishly kept in our joint account. I updated my will, removing Richard as my healthcare proxy. Small steps, each one a quiet declaration of independence. Through it all, I maintained our routine. I cooked his favorite meals, listened to his work stories, slept beside him in our bed. But something had shifted inside me. Each act of normalcy felt like performance art, a living exhibition titled The Dutiful Wife. I observed myself with detached curiosity. How convincing my smiles, how practiced my affection. Then came Thursday, exactly 1 month from the day I found the receipt. Richard announced over breakfast that he needed to go to Chicago the following week for a conference. The same conference he'd allegedly attended when he was actually in Portland with Jennifer. Chicago? I repeated, stirring my coffee. The marketing summit? He nodded, not looking up from his phone. Yeah, same as last month. Should be quick, just Tuesday to Thursday. The audacity was almost impressive. I sipped my coffee and said, "That's nice." The Harbor View Inn in Portland has a much better view than any Chicago hotel, though. The silence that followed was exquisite. I watched realization crawl across his face like a shadow. First confusion, then shock. Finally a resignation that settled into the lines around his mouth. He set down his phone. "How long have you known?" he asked finally. "Long enough," I said. "Long enough to find the new cologne in your drawer. Long enough to track your Denver trip to Jennifer's house. Long enough to speak with a divorce attorney." He flinched at the last part. "Ellie, I can explain." "I'm sure you can," I interrupted, my voice steady. "You've always been good with words, Richard. It's one of the things I loved about you. But I'm not interested in explanations or apologies or promises to end it. I'm interested in a clean, fair division of assets and as little drama as possible for the kids." He stared at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. This wasn't the script he'd prepared for. The bewilderment in his eyes might have been comical if it weren't so sad. He'd expected tears, recriminations, perhaps even forgiveness after sufficient groveling. He hadn't expected this stranger who wore his wife's face but spoke with unfamiliar authority. "You don't want to try counseling? To work through this?" he asked. I laughed then, a genuine sound that surprised us both. "Richard, you've been living a double life. You've lied to my face for months, possibly longer. You've shared your body, your time, and presumably your feelings with another woman while maintaining the fiction of our marriage. What exactly do you think a counselor will say that would make any of that acceptable to me?" He had no answer. We sat in silence as morning light streamed through the kitchen windows, illuminating the dust motes between us. All those tiny, invisible things suddenly made visible. "I never meant to hurt you," he said finally, the ultimate cliché of unfaithful spouses everywhere. "I know," I replied, "and I meant it. You just wanted what you wanted and didn't consider the cost. But here's the thing, Richard. I didn't consider the cost either. The cost of staying silent. The cost of pretending I don't know what kind of man you've become. And I've decided it's too high." I stood and carried my coffee cup to the sink, rinsing it methodically before placing it in the dishwasher. Such an ordinary action in such an extraordinary moment. "I've booked a hotel room for tonight," I said. "I think you should stay here. It's better for appearances until we decide how to tell the children. My lawyer will contact yours next week with initial paperwork. I've taken only what's legally mine. Everything else can be negotiated through proper channels." "Just like that?" he asked, voice hollow. 26 years? And you can walk away just like that?" I turned to look at him. This man I had loved since college. This stranger who had shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. "No, Richard. Not just like that. Like someone who spent a month processing betrayal while you were busy texting your girlfriend from our bedroom. Like someone who deserves better than what you've offered. Like someone who finally understands her own worth." I walked upstairs to retrieve the suitcase I'd packed that morning while he was in the shower. When I came back down, he was still sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. "I did love you," he said, as I reached the door. "I still do, in my way." I paused, hand on the doorknob. "Your way isn't enough for me anymore," I said softly, and stepped into the bright autumn day, leaving behind the shadow of a life that no longer fit the woman I was becoming. The hotel room became my sanctuary for exactly 3 nights. On the 4th morning, I signed a 6-month lease on a small apartment downtown, walking distance from the bookstore where I'd worked part-time since our children left for college. It was nothing like our sprawling colonial with its manicured lawn and granite countertops, just a 1-bedroom with scuffed hardwood floors and windows that rattled when the wind blew. But it was mine, untouched by memories or lies. Telling our children was the hardest part. Emma flew in from Seattle, while Jason drove up from Boston. I'd asked them to meet me at a neutral location, a private room at a restaurant we'd celebrated birthdays at for years. Richard wanted to be there, but I insisted on speaking to them first. Another decision that would have been unthinkable in my previous life. Dad had an affair, I told them simply after the appetizers arrived. Food none of us would touch. It's been going on for some time, and I've decided to file for divorce. Their reactions mirrored their personalities perfectly. Emma, analytical like her father, asked detailed questions about timelines and logistics. Jason, sensitive and protective, reached for my hand across the table, his eyes filling with tears I refused to shed myself. "Are you okay, Mom?" Emma asked finally, her lawyer's mind having cataloged all the relevant facts. The question caught me off guard. In 26 years of marriage, through pregnancies and career changes and the deaths of my parents, Richard had asked if I was okay perhaps a dozen times. My children asked me nearly every time we spoke. I paused, searching for the right word. Not fine. Not good. Not okay. "I'm becoming," I said finally. "I'm becoming someone new." They looked confused, but I couldn't explain further. How could I tell them that beneath the pain and humiliation, I discovered an unexpected freedom? That each decision I made without considering Richard's opinion felt like unwrapping a gift? That I'd started waking before dawn, not from anxiety, but from a strange exhilaration about what the day might hold? The divorce process ground forward with all the grace of a rusty machine. Richard swung between contrition and indignation, apologizing one day and demanding explanations for my coldness the next. I maintained the same calm I'd found the morning of our confrontation. His emotional weather no longer determined mine. Friends chose sides, as friends do. Some avoided me, unsure what to say to a woman suddenly single after decades of coupledom. Others rallied with casseroles and wine nights and offers of spare bedrooms. My sister Kate flew in from Phoenix and spent a week helping me furnish my apartment. Her no-nonsense approach to both IKEA instructions and my situation exactly what I needed. "You know what really gets me?" she said one night, as we assembled a bookshelf, wine glasses balanced precariously on moving boxes. "That you didn't throw a single plate. That man deserved at least one dinner service aimed at his head." I laughed, surprising myself with the sound. I considered it, but then I'd have to clean it up. "Fair point," she conceded, testing the bookshelf's stability with a skeptical push. "So what now? Dating apps? That handsome manager at your bookstore? Swearing off men entirely?" The question echoed ones I'd been asking myself in the quiet of my new space. What did come next? For so long, my future had been inextricably linked with Richard's. Retirement plans, grandchildren, aging together. Now the path ahead was unmarked, uncharted. "I don't know," I admitted. "I haven't thought beyond getting through each day." Kate studied me over the rim of her glass. "You're different, Ellie. It's not just the situation. Something's changed in you." I nodded, unable to articulate how fundamentally my inner landscape had shifted. How the woman who had built her life around being Richard's wife, Emma and Jason's mother, the perfect hostess, the reliable friend, that woman was receding like a tide, revealing someone I barely recognized but desperately wanted to know. 3 months after moving out, I received the final divorce papers in my lawyer's office. Richard had agreed to a fair settlement after his initial bluster faded. The house would be sold, assets divided. 26 years of marriage reduced to signatures and legal terminology. "Congratulations," my lawyer said as I signed the last document. "You're officially divorced." The words should have felt monumental, but instead they seemed almost irrelevant. Formal recognition of a transformation that had already occurred. I was reminded of how Emma, at age 7, had insisted on a graduation ceremony when she learned to ride her bike without training wheels. "But Mom," she'd said with childhood wisdom, "I already know how to do it. The ceremony just tells everyone else." As I walked out of the lawyer's office into the bright afternoon, that's exactly how I felt. The paperwork merely confirmed what I already knew. I had been riding on my own for some time now, finding a balance I never knew I possessed. Winter melted into spring, and with the changing season came unexpected opportunities. The bookstore owner, Margaret, a formidable 70-something with a silver pixie cut and reading glasses perpetually perched on her head, called me into her cluttered office one rainy Tuesday. "I'm retiring," she announced without preamble, gesturing for me to sit in the only chair not covered with book catalogs. "Selling the shop. Thought you might want first refusal." I blinked at her, certain I'd misheard. "You want to sell me the bookstore? Why not? You've got good taste in literature, you understand the business, and frankly, you're the only person I trust not to turn it into a coffee shop that happens to sell a few bestsellers." She pushed a folder across her desk. "My asking price. Think about it." I took the folder home and spread the contents across my small kitchen table. Financial statements, property information, customer demographics. The numbers were intimidating but not impossible. With my divorce settlement and some careful budgeting, I could make it work. The realization hit me with unexpected force. I wanted this. Not because it was practical or sensible or what someone in my position should do, but because the thought of making the bookstore mine filled me with genuine excitement. When had I last felt that? Not in years. Perhaps not since before I married Richard. I called Emma that night, needing to voice the idea aloud. "You're going to buy a bookstore?" she asked, her surprise evident even across 3,000 miles. "I'm thinking about it," I hedged. "It's probably crazy." "No," she said slowly. "It's not crazy. It's actually perfect for you, Mom. I just never thought you'd do something so impulsive," I suggested. "Independent," she corrected. "Dad always made the big decisions." Her observation stung with its accuracy. Richard had decided where we lived, how we invested, what cars we drove. Not through force, but through a subtle assumption of authority I had never challenged. I had deferred and accommodated for so long that decision-making muscles had atrophied from disuse. "Well," I said, surprised by the firmness in my voice, "I'm deciding this one." 2 weeks later, I signed the purchase agreement. The bookstore, now my bookstore, would transition to my ownership over the summer. Margaret would stay on part-time for 3 months to help with the handover, then depart for her long-planned tour of European literary landmarks. Word spread quickly in our small community. Former colleagues from my teaching days stopped by with congratulations. Book club friends brought champagne and business advice. Even Jason drove up from Boston one weekend, helping me sketch ideas for minor renovations on the back of a napkin over lunch. "You seem happy, Mom," he said, studying me with the careful attention he'd had since childhood. "Happier than before." "I am," I admitted. "Is that terrible? That I'm happier after everything fell apart?" He shook his head. "It didn't fall apart. It just changed shape. Like those transformation puzzles you used to get me, where you have to rearrange the pieces to make something new." His insight, so simple and profound, stayed with me as I navigated my new reality. I was rearranging the pieces of my life, discovering how they could fit together differently, but still create something whole. The day I replaced the bookstore sign, from Margaret's books to new chapter books and cafe, felt like a baptism. I stood on the sidewalk in the early morning light, watching the installation crew secure the new lettering to the storefront. Passers-by stopped to comment on the change, offering encouragement and promises to visit. Richard called that evening. We'd had minimal contact since the divorce was finalized, communicating mostly through lawyers or brief practical texts about remaining shared responsibilities. "I heard about the bookstore," he said after awkward pleasantries. "That's a big step." "It is," I agreed, wondering how he'd found out. Probably through our shared friends, the ones who still maintained connections with both of us. "I'm surprised," he continued. You never mentioned wanting to own a business when we were together." The comment wasn't accusatory, just puzzled, but it ignited a slow burn of irritation in my chest. "You never asked," I said simply. The silence that followed contained volumes. Acknowledgement, perhaps, of how little he had inquired about my dreams during our marriage. Or maybe just discomfort at being called out, however gently. "Well, congratulations," he said finally. "I hope it works out." "Thank you," I replied, and meant it. His good wishes didn't matter to me anymore, but the civility did. We had children together, a history that couldn't be erased even if the marriage could. After we hung up, I wandered through my apartment, touching the new life I was building. Books stacked on every surface, business plans spread across the dining table, a half-finished mug of tea beside the reading chair I'd splurged on. None of it was perfect. The apartment still had drafty windows. The bookstore needed more work than I'd initially realized. And some days I still woke up reaching for a husband who wasn't there. But imperfection had its own beauty, like the Japanese art of kintsugi that Margaret had shown me. Broken pottery repaired with gold, celebrating the fractures rather than hiding them. I was piecing myself back together, not as I was before, but as something new, something stronger at the broken places. 1 year to the day after I found the hotel receipt, my bookstore hosted its first author event. I'd spent weeks preparing, ordering extra copies of the novel, arranging chairs in our newly renovated reading space, designing flyers that now hung in shop windows throughout downtown. The author was a local success story, her debut novel climbing bestseller lists and generating award buzz. What I hadn't prepared for was seeing Jennifer Lamotte walk through my door 30 minutes before the event. I recognized her immediately from my internet stalking days, the confident blonde from Richard's Other Life. She browsed the fiction section, unaware of who I was as I stood frozen behind the counter, a stack of promotional bookmarks clutched in my suddenly sweaty hand. She looked different in person, shorter, with fine lines around her eyes that her filtered social media photos had concealed. She wore a green dress I could never have carried off, and shoes that probably cost more than my weekly revenue. She looked exactly like the kind of woman Richard would choose. Polished, sophisticated, the opposite of what I had become in our later years together. "Can I help you find something?" I asked, before I could stop myself, professional habit overriding self-preservation. She looked up with a smile. "Just browsing before the reading. I've heard wonderful things about this store. The renovation looks amazing." "Thank you," I said, heartbeat accelerating. "I'm Eleanor. I own New Chapter." Recognition flickered across her features, a slight widening of the eyes, a momentary parting of lips. She knew exactly who I was. Of course she did. Richard would have told her about his ex-wife buying a bookstore, especially one in the same town where they'd conducted their affair. "Jennifer?" she said after a beat, extending her hand with what seemed like genuine grace. "It's nice to meet you." We shook hands, the moment surreal in its civility. Part of me had imagined this meeting differently, tearful recriminations perhaps, or cold disdain. Instead, I felt oddly detached, as if watching a scene in a film about someone else's life. "Are you?" I began, unsure how to phrase the question delicately. "Are you still with Richard?" She glanced down at her left hand, and I noticed for the first time the diamond ring catching light from the overhead fixtures. "We're engaged. The wedding is in September. Congratulations," I said automatically, the word emerging before I could examine whether I meant it. An awkward silence expanded between us, filled with unspoken histories and shared knowledge of the same man. "I didn't know this was your store," she said finally. "I can leave if it's uncomfortable." I considered the offer. It would be easier if she left. Simpler. But the woman I had become over the past year didn't take the easy path anymore. "Stay," I said. "The author is brilliant, and we have excellent wine." She nodded, gratitude and something like respect crossing her features. As she turned back to the bookshelves, I escaped to the stockroom, leaning against the cool wall and breathing deeply. Richard was getting married again. The news should have devastated me, or at least provoked some emotional response. Instead, I felt only a mild curiosity, as if hearing about a distant acquaintance's life change. When had that happened? When had the man who was once the center of my universe become someone whose major life decisions generated no more feeling than a weather report? By the time I emerged, the store had filled with attendees. Jennifer sat in the back row, partly obscured by a tall man in front of her. I moved through the crowd, introducing the author and making sure everyone had wine or water. The event unfolded seamlessly, the audience engaged, the author charming and articulate. I caught myself smiling with genuine pride at what my little store had become. As people lined up for book signing afterward, Jennifer approached the counter where I was ringing up sales. "This was lovely," she said, placing a copy of the novel beside the register. "You've created something special here." I scanned the barcode, acutely aware of her gaze. "Thank you. It's been a learning curve. I can imagine." She hesitated, then added, "I owe you an apology." I knew he was married when it started. There's no excuse for that. The directness of her admission startled me. I'd spent months imagining her as a villain in my story, the younger woman who'd stolen my husband. But standing before me was just a person, flawed and complicated like everyone else. "Why him?" I asked, the question escaping before I could filter it. Of all the men in the world, why a married one? She looked surprised by my candor, then thoughtful. "He made me feel seen," she said finally, in a way no one had before, or at least that's what I thought at the time. I nodded, understanding with painful clarity. Richard had made me feel that way once too, in the early years before I became background noise in his life. I wondered how long it would take for Jennifer to fade into his periphery as well, but kept the thought to myself. "I hope he's different with you," I said, handing her the bagged book and receipt. And strangely, I meant it. Not for Richard's sake, but for hers. She studied me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. "I'm not what I expected either," I replied with a small smile. After the store emptied and I'd locked up for the night, I walked home through quiet streets, replaying the encounter. There was a time when meeting Jennifer would have been the worst thing I could imagine. Now it felt like closing a chapter that had remained stubbornly open. At home, I kicked off my shoes and poured a glass of the leftover event wine, carrying it to the small balcony overlooking the town park. Stars punctured the dark sky above, the same stars that had witnessed my marriage, its unraveling, and now its final resolution in my heart. I raised my glass to the night, not in toast to Richard and Jennifer, or even to my own resilience, but to unexpected meetings and surprising outcomes, to the woman I had discovered beneath layers of compromise and accommodation, to the realization that the end of one story is merely the beginning of another, often better one.